Iran is at a crossroads. Its military and nuclear programs sustain major setbacks, with the Israeli attacks this summer, which killed top generals, nuclear scientists, destroyed many of its air defense systems, and, along with strikes by the United States, damaged its nuclear enrichment facilities. Although what happened to its extant highly enriched uranium stocks is still unclear. Now, the Islamic Republic is again in a diplomatic standoff over its nuclear program, with Tehran suspending cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, and the UK, France, and Germany moving to reimpose UN sanctions, what's known as snapback. We have Mohammad Tabaar back on the podcast to discuss the geopolitical and diplomatic fallout from the conflict, as well as what lies ahead for the regime and the country's political future amid internal challenges, including a severe drought this summer and major shortages of basic commodities. Mohammad is a Middle East Fellow at the Baker Institute. He's written widely on Iran's domestic and foreign policy challenges, including a recent article in Foreign Affairs following the war titled "The Islamic Republic's New Lease on Life." I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas, and this is Baker Briefing. Mohammad, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Ambassador.
Let's start with the current situation in Iran. Look, the 12-day conflict with Israel, the one-day set of attacks by the United States on 3 key enrichment facilities, major drought, shortages of water, shortages of fuel, appointments, reappointments within the regime. The supreme leader is visible, he's not visible, he's in charge, no, he's not in charge. What's going on in Tehran? What's going on in Iran as a whole? And what does it mean for the survival of the revolutionary regime?
So the initial reaction after the war started on June 13 was a lot of shock on the part of the population and elite. Within hours, the Israelis carried out a major operation decapitating Iran's military leadership and assassinated several Iranian nuclear scientists. And initially, there was a lot of confusion as to what was going on. As you said, the supreme leader was basically invisible for several days. It took many days before he came out and issued a statement. We don't really know when he issued that statement. Probably it was in a bunker. And then on the part of the population, for several days, there was a lot of inaction, to the point that some Iranian social scientists thought maybe the Iranian citizens did not take the war seriously the first 4 or 5 days after the war. I mean, initially, there were expectations on the part of some dissidents and maybe the Israelis that as a result of the war, there would be an uprising. Certainly, that did not happen. But the support of the regime initially did not happen either. It appeared that many people thought this was going to be a conflict between 2 governments, and they were waiting to see what was happening. But as the conflict expanded and affected ordinary citizens, and many Iranians were killed, I think the official figure is around 1,000. In addition to nuclear facilities, the energy infrastructure was also attacked. I think at that point, a sense of nationalism and rally around the flag appeared. So now the question is this going to last, this level of social cohesion? We don't know, precisely for all the reasons that you mentioned. There are a lot of fault lines, a lot of shortages. There's a lot of anger, grievances against the government, and we don't know how this is going to continue. But the system appears to have a sense of confidence that it has survived the war and it has some minimum support of the population for now.
Mohammad, there's a striking shift in the tools being used by the regime to evoke national sentiment. Songs that predated 79 and the revolution, images of classic Iranian history, real or imagined, which were anathema to the revolutionary Islamic regime, now being brought back in public presentation form. Clearly, the regime, much like Putin in Russia, is seeking to call upon the deep wells of national sentiment, national spirit. And you've argued, for the moment, it has at least prevented dramatic shifts against the regime. If the external factors here, sanctions, and we'll talk about snapback and the implications of that for Iran, the reimposition of sanctions by the European 3 in a moment. But if sanctions continue, if there are fuel shortages, the historic drought, which is denying water, power shortages, if these all continue, does the regime, in your view, still win that calculus of strength and assets against weaknesses, vulnerabilities?
You're absolutely right that the system has made a remarkable shift, ideologically speaking, from Islamism to nationalism. They try to preserve that sense of nationalism, that sense of Islamism that they had since the 79 revolution. But in the past 10 years, they have tried to adopt Persian nationalism as well. And it's remarkable because, as you said, in the early days of the revolution, they were against Persian nationalism. In fact, they went after nationalistic opposition and Persian nationalist symbols. But about 10 years ago, they started a gradual shift. But I think many among the people did not really buy that. But that trend has, in a way, intensified since the 12-Day War. And as you said, they are now appropriating Persian mythology of this famous figure of Arash the Archer. And now they're comparing that figure to the IRGC commanders who were in charge of Iran's missile program. So they're adopting this. And I think the population are it's difficult for them. They don't really know how to adopt to this, how to react to this. On the one hand, as I said, there are a lot of grievances. On the other hand, there are many who believe that in this war, at the end of the day, this regime managed to preserve the territorial integrity of the country for now. And again, many also blame the system for causing this conflict as well. So there is a sense of confusion as how to adopt to this. But there is no question that the leadership in Iran is kind of shameless in adopting this. It's fascinating that when the war ended, when Iran's supreme leader came out and there was a ceremony, I think it was a religious ceremony, he specifically asked a preacher to sing a song on Iran. And that was really shocking. So they are doing this, and they are combining Islamism and Persian nationalism across the board throughout the country.
Mohammad, there is, at least for me, a fascinating and public resurfacing of classic reformist so-called rhetoric, critiques, personalities, and a pushback against that. For our listeners, what are the major divides within the political bases, plural, of the regime?
So definitely, the fault line between the conservatives and the reformists goes back to decades ago. And for a long time, although the conservatives always had an upper hand in terms of controlling the key institutions led by the supreme leader and the IRGC, the reformists always relied on popular support. And they often tried to outmaneuver the conservative leadership by basically tapping to this popular support. And I think a climax of that, a manifestation of that, was the JCPOA, for example. We now know that the supreme leader was really reluctant to go with the nuclear agreement. But in the end, the reformists at the time, through elections, they managed to impose a lot of constraints on the supreme leader and basically make that happen. And you're absolutely right that after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, that really undermined the reformists for several years and marginalized them. But in recent weeks and months, especially after the 12-Day War, we see the reformists are coming out again. Former President Rouhani, Javad Zarif, former foreign minister, they've come out and they're trying to say that it's time to compromise and putting a lot of pressure on the regime to basically tone down its rhetoric against the U.S. and against Israel and soften its position. On the other hand, I don't know to what extent the reformists can rely on the popular support that they had. Because the popular support has kind of declined, they may not have much leverage. But again, the fact that they feel comfortable to coming out and saying these things shows that there are competing voices in Iran, and the system does not really have a complete monopoly over the political discourse.
And where should we place the president, Pezeshkian, right now? Where does he fit?
So the president ran on a reformist platform and enjoyed a lot of support from reformist figures. But he's not really a strong figure. When he won the elections, he was very clear that he won the elections as a result of the support from the supreme leader, who allowed him to run and helped him to get through the vetting process by the Guardian Council. So he is in a difficult position, and overall, I would say he doesn't have the same leverage that the previous presidents had. He won elections in a historically low turnout presidential election, so he doesn't have the popular support as the previous reformist presidents did have. But to be fair, he did manage to basically deliver some of his promises, not to the extent that he had promised. One was not to enforce the veiling law, but he has not been able to deal with the internet censorship issues and other things. But overall, he doesn't have much power compared to the supreme leader. together for sure.
And where exactly is the supreme leader, not physically, but in terms of political authority? Any shifts, any diminution of his authority? Is it clear?
Exactly. It is unclear. So up to the war, he was present everywhere, all the time. And he seemed to be basically micromanaging the system. Since the war, he seems to be a bit hands-off. And I don't know if that means his position has been weakened or maybe he's delegating more. So it is possible that he is trying to establish certain institutions that if there is another round of conflict with Israel, if the top leadership is decapitated, these institutions can carry out and continue basically ruling the country, keeping the country together. For example, there is a new head of the National Security Council. There is a new Defense Council. So there seems to be some structural changes within the system.
Although lots of questions about what the new Defense Council really is and how it relates with the old Supreme National Security Council.
You're right. There's a lot of overlap, and it's unclear what the division of labor is. But it does appear that the system is moving towards a situation in which if there is another massive attack from Israel, it can survive.
So bottom line, Mohammad, at least as of this moment, despite challenges as a consequence of the conflict, independent of the conflict, services, the drought, power supply, the regime is still in control.
Yes, it is. And interestingly, the Iranian officials are very clear that they are still in a state of war with Israel. They keep saying that what is going on now is not even a ceasefire, meaning that there is no agreement between Iran and Israel. It's just a pause in the conflict, which means there could be another round of conflict anytime. And it seems that they're kind of using this to cover up for other issues and other shortages that you mentioned.
The Pahlavis, do they have a future?
So the Pahlavis were relatively popular, I would say, before the conflict, because many people had some positive images of what the previous Shah and Reza Shah and others did in building the modern state in Iran. The institutions that Reza Shah built are still the institutions that are running the country 100 years later. It's incredible. But I would say that as a result of the current Pahlavi, the current crown prince, publicly sided with Israel and called on Iranians to rise up during the conflict. And that did not happen. So there are many observers who believe that his popularity may have declined. But there's no question that he has been very active. He just sent a group of representatives to Israel a couple of days ago. But I don't know to what extent he's popular in Iran right now. And as I said, because of the fact that he publicly stands against the state that attacked Iran, his popularity may have declined, for now at least.
Crackdown by the regime on oppositionists as a consequence of the 12-day conflict?
Yes, the repression has gone up. Let me qualify that by saying in some areas, the regime has been careful not to make people even more angry. For example, when it comes to veiling issues, they have relaxed the dress code, for example. Or on freedom of expression, they're allowing people, the newspapers, to criticize the regime to some extent. But first of all, this is reversible. And secondly, when it comes to other areas, several people have been executed. They were accused of collaborating with Israel during the war. According to official statements, about 20,000 individuals have been arrested, suspected of collaborating with Israel during the war. A lot of ethnic groups, especially the Kurds, have come under suppression. And Afghan immigrants, again, were accused of collaborating with Israel. A lot of
and mass expulsions of
Exactly.
Afghan immigrants to the detriment of many sectors in the service industries.
Absolutely.
In Tehran and elsewhere.
Absolutely. The regime used this as an opportunity, rounded them up, and sent many of them back to Afghanistan.
Let's switch to the reason for the conflict, ostensibly, to begin with, which was the nuclear enrichment program. Whatever the ultimate forensics show is the status of the already highly enriched uranium, the 60% uranium, or the facilities that are necessary to further enrich uranium. Damage was done. Significant damage was done. And the spotlight is intense on any effort to reconstruct, rebuild, or relocate to new facilities, harder to get facilities, to resume an enrichment program. But Iran has chosen to end cooperation with the IAEA, as a consequence of which the European three have announced on August 28 the beginning of the one-month period for Iran to rectify the cooperation and transparency issue on the nuclear program or face a snapback of sanctions. What do you think is going to happen, Mohammad? Will Iran, in fact, take the necessary steps to avoid snapback, or are they prepared to accept the consequences?
So officially, they have been saying that they are going to continue their hardened position.
Withdraw from the NPT.
Exactly. That if the snapback is triggered, they're going to withdraw from the NPT. And they say that they have already absorbed much of the pain as a result of the sanctions because of the U.S. sanctions against Iran. And the UN sanctions are not going to impose a lot of extra damage or extra pain on Iran because they say it's mostly psychological. In fact, they say the secondary U.S. sanctions have been far more effective because it includes the oil sector, financial transactions, and they say the UN sanctions will not be as effective. But many voices, including the reformist voices that you mentioned a few minutes ago, they have been warning the establishment, the system, the regime that it has to be very careful because once the snapback mechanism is triggered, it could actually bring Iran under a lot of pressure. Iranian tanker ships can be stopped. Basically, it could create a lot more pressure on Iran. Negotiations are going on between Iran and the Europeans. What the Europeans want is full cooperation by Iran with the IAEA so they would not trigger this mechanism. But from Iran's perspective, working with the IAEA, allowing the IAEA inspectors to return to Iran and visiting the nuclear facilities could potentially pave the way for war because they could find out exactly which areas were damaged and they would provide US and Israel that information. So that's at least what they say, that they cannot, for security reasons, they cannot do this. So the question is, will Iran and the Europeans come to an agreement? There have been other proposals. For example, Iran would, to some extent, work with the IAEA, and then the snapback mechanism would be extended for another year. So far, we haven't seen a compromise. But as you said, we have until the end of September to see if that will happen or not.
We've talked about conflict. Let's talk a moment about diplomacy. President Trump clearly wanted to see an agreement reached with Iran, which would be regarded as historic, not just as a success contributory to a Nobel Peace Prize for him, but also reopening Iran to business and the world. It was a very ambitious aspiration, which appears to be nowhere right now. Mohammad, to the extent that the U.S. is actually interested in a diplomatic negotiation to achieve that broader, beyond nuclear, return of Iran to the international community objective, what's the position on the Iranian side?
So in a way, the JCPOA itself was an attempt to achieve that goal, that Iran would make a major compromise on the nuclear issue, and in return, there would be basically a move towards normalcy. And that experience has created a lot of commitment problems inside Iran when it comes to the U.S. And then the latest round of negotiations between Iran and the U.S., it was in the middle of the negotiations that the war happened. And again, that created even more distrust on the part, not distrust of the U.S. inside Iran. Just before the war started, a few weeks before that, maybe a few months before that, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, published an article in which he said Iran could open its market. There would be potentially up to $1 trillion market inside Iran. So it seemed that at least rhetorically, Iran was expressing interest. But I think for two reasons, I'm not very optimistic. Number one, as I said, the experience of the JCPOA and the last round of negotiations. On the other hand, I think there are certain power circles inside Iran, including the IRGC and the Supreme Leader, who do not see this in their interests at all.
The regional picture. Very dramatic changes since September of last year, all shattering or significantly damaging, at least, the so-called axis of resistance, putatively led by Iran. Diminution of Hezbollah, not elimination. Hezbollah remains an armed and politically potent entity within Lebanon, but diminished in its ability to dictate to the system. The Lebanese cabinet is meeting on the issue of how to now set and enforce a timetable for the disarmament of Hezbollah. Very, very difficult issue. In Syria, the dramatic events of late November and December, the overthrow of the Assad regime, which was a critical, vital facilitator of Iran's geographic presence in the Levant and connectivity to Lebanon. The Houthis remain the Houthis. They continue to strike Israel with less and less impact. The U.S. is not in active combat with them now. Israel absolutely is with the decapitation of the largely placeholder and figurehead members of the so-called Houthi cabinet. What's Iran do now?
So you're right that there is no question that Iran's non-state allies in the region have suffered major blow with Hamas, Hezbollah, and to some extent even the Houthis and Iran's allies in Iraq. And definitely the overthrow of Assad was another major blow to Iran. But it seems that the regime believes that the strategy in a way worked because Israel attacked Iran after it went through these layers of non-state actors. In fact, many conservative commentators in Iran say that this was exactly the goal of Qasem Soleimani when he established this axis of resistance, that it would buy Iran time for its attack by Israel. And they say Iran needs to go back and double down and try to basically reconstitute these allies. It will take some time, but it seems that they think these groups have been created not necessarily by Iran, but based on the local grievances because of Israel, because of foreign occupation. So there is a perception in Iran that because of the war in Gaza, locals now have even more grievances. So these allies, these groups could be back on their feet in a couple of years. Hamas is still fighting. As you said, Hezbollah is weakened but doesn't want to disarm. The Houthis are still fighting. So there, and the
PMFs, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, while they have been very quiet, not wishing to raise their heads and have them cut off, they're still there. And they're still armed, and elections are coming very shortly in Iraq, where Iran is still seen to have a very significant role.
Exactly. And I would say there are new groups potentially joining the axis of resistance. According to Iranian media, there are new groups in Syria that are allying with the axis of resistance against the Jolani government in Syria. I don't know to what extent these groups are credible, real, and promising, but that's the perception that eventually there will be something.
Although to reconstruct what existed before September of last year, the pager detonations that took place in Lebanon, that is very, very difficult to see. It was a construct based on the Assad regime's both strengths and weaknesses in Syria, on Hezbollah's absolute domination of the political and security sphere, no interaction by the U.S. with either Syria or Lebanon of a meaningful contact. There's extensive U.S. engagement today to try to stabilize them. It's going to be hard for Iran to do.
You're right. And I think because of that, Iran is also following a second track, and that is working with the state actors in the region. Iran has been coordinating with Egypt, with Jordan, negotiating with Saudi Arabia. So it seems that, especially after the war, they're pursuing a dual track. On the one hand, they do want to reconstitute their allies in the region. On the other hand, they're increasingly realizing that they do need to work with state actors in the region. There is a perception that as a result of the war, many Arab states in the region view Israel as a bigger threat than Iran, and they're willing to work with Iran. Iran's foreign minister has said several times that there have been more meetings between Iranians and the Egyptians, even though the two countries don't have diplomatic relations yet, than meetings with other countries that Iran has diplomatic relations with. Meaning that even countries that used to be enemies of Iran, Iran sees that now there might be a potential path for normalization as a result of this war.
So, Mohammad, you can wave your policy wand. What is it the U.S. should be doing right now to minimize the Iranian challenge or challenges to U.S. interests, to maximize U.S. interests?
I would say it appears that Iran is very careful not to do anything that is provocative. What's really fascinating is that after the war, Iranian officials started making statements that were almost echoing President Trump's statements about how much damage, it inflicted on Iran. President Trump said that U.S. attacks obliterated Iran's nuclear facilities, and soon after, Iran's foreign minister kept saying that Iran's nuclear facilities have suffered serious damages. So it does appear that Iran is careful not to do anything, at least in the short term. On the one hand, you're right. They're not opening up. They are pursuing what they say a strategic ambiguity. They don't want the U.S. or the IAEA or others to see what they have done. On the other hand, I think they're careful not to do anything, at least in the next 3 years, that would invite more attacks by Israel or by the United States. The policy that they're pursuing appears to be maximum interaction and maximum resistance, meaning they're going to negotiate and interact across the board with everyone. And at the same time, they're not going to easily compromise. As I said, their position keeps getting more hardline as a result of the experience of the JCPOA, the experience of the negotiations last few months, and then the result of the war with Israel. At the same time, they are willing to negotiate, I think, with the United States. And despite all the distrust, I think negotiations and diplomacy, both directly and through Arab mediators, might be a path that Iranians would reciprocate.
If the president continues to want or believe he has to have, for his personal ambitions, a negotiated deal, vice the declarative, I have eliminated their nuclear program, we don't need a negotiated settlement. And I don't know where that will stand over the time ahead. Right now, there's clearly no urgency to a U.S.-Iranian negotiation, and Iran has not indicated if such a negotiation would be a simple one. Better to declare total victory than engage in a diplomatic process, which falls somewhat short of that. But we will be carrying on this discussion into the future as the domestic situation, internal, external factors, continue, whether they are positive or negative to the regime, and as we see whether or not, in fact, the external parties, Lebanon, Syria, move in a positive direction from the standpoint of U.S. interests and against Iran, or whether, in fact, the optimism and hopes of the present aren't really fulfilled. All to be seen. Thank you, Mohammad. This has been Baker Briefing, where we make news make sense. A link to Mohammad's article in Foreign Affairs is in the show notes. This podcast is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. We'd like to hear your feedback and guest suggestions. Email us at bakerbriefing@rice.edu. This episode was produced by Karina Zemel. Audio production was led by Kevin Young. Learn more at bakerinstitute.org, and thanks for listening.